Thanks very much for that, Rob. Great to have that sort of level of expertise and experience brought to the subject. And this issue of banks and insurance companies, we've talked about bureaucrats and all of that. I think one of the things that's really I'm aware of that I often say to people is we talk about the nanny state, we talk about safety, we talk about regulations. Some of those come from government, but the vast majority of them actually come from insurance companies. And we cease to see that insurance companies have become a de facto regulation-making body that actually oppresses just about everybody in society. So this issue that you brought up at, towards the end here about, do we want to be borrowable and insurable, or do we not want to be borrowable and insurable? It's quite a big issue because in terms of that divide, a whole lot of other things follow. You become borrowable and insurable, but it becomes, the prices go up, it becomes a commodity and all the regulations come in. So thanks very much for bringing that up. And in the short time we had, now we've got lunch, which I'm sure you're all pleased for, and everybody's been sitting. So thanks everybody for being so patient and sticking with us.
Started again, so I hope everyone had a great lunch. I'd like to introduce staying at Sylvanspring.
His talk on land sharing now, new and ethical communities, and I'm told you're a veteran at starting new communities and have a lot of knowledge. Young veteran. Sorry. Yep. We also have a gentleman in the audience who has written a paper on high housing prices and why they are the way they are and what we could do about it. And it's just up the front here if anyone would like to grab a copy.
Hello, thank you. I first want to start by saying I feel really honoured to be here, and thank you to all the elders, Carol, Meg, Gay, Rob. You guys are like the elders, and I'm sort of the next generation coming up, benefiting from also all the other people in the crowd that have been involved in this from your hard work in terms of communities and opportunities. So I would like to give a thanks to the elders I see in this movement that us younger generations are benefiting from. And so my name's Shane Sylvanspring. I don't come from Melbourne originally, but my mum did drag me up to Nimbin when I was 13 and forced me to live in a teepee. And so I did have some interactions with the Nimbin area when I was younger, but have moved up here about 10 years ago on my quest for communities and created a small community in Maynarm, where I live now. And being a town planner in background and living in places such as Findhorn and Damanhur and learning about eco-village design and, being an activist, I saw community living as one of the solutions for a lot of the issues in today's society. I became a big advocate for this way of living. And so therefore I've been helping communities form or in different stages. And recently thrown myself into probably the biggest project I've been involved in, which is the Afterley Eco-Village, which, learning from all the things that have been talked about, how do we create an MO in 2020s? And some of the issues I saw in the 70s is a very different set of circumstances than we have today. For starters, we have huge land prices, and we have all these regulations that have been talked about. But we also have, I would say, a little bit less of that common vision that was around in the 70s. So it's harder to bring a group of people passionate about this way of life and based on that passion create a whole community. But there is people that are passionate, but often are very busy in this day and age, to come together and do that and drop everything. So with Afterley, when people came to me, said, we want to create a community and how can we do this? So, been musing about this and how can we do this? And so one of the things is that I do 100% believe in this community-driven, MOs need to be community-driven rather than developer-driven. And although CTs I think are a great idea, one of the failings I saw in the Byron Shire was that they allowed the new CTs that have emerged in the last 5 years, there was no community because there was no time frame between MO and CT. So what developers were doing were buying the MO land and straight away converting it to CT and selling the lots off like a normal rural subdivision. So unfortunately, CT might be great for existing communities, but it wasn't working in the manner that was hopeful. Unfortunately, those last few properties that could have been affordable housing community were actually sort of more developer rural subdivisions that were quite expensive. You know, some of them are $1 million a lot, so it's not really that same essence. Yeah, there's discussion around that, but that could have, you know, easily fixed with a big tweak of just like you have to be an MO for 5 years before you convert to CT. You know, that would have probably allowed more community-driven projects. Sorry, I'm going to just waffle a little bit because I didn't really prepare many notes. So back onto Afterly. So this latest project, we're trying to also make it affordable. You know, one of the themes is, in this day and age, how do we create it affordable when the land prices are more, building prices are more? So firstly, we had to get away from the coast because the land is cheaper. And scale as well, because with the more people, the cheaper it can be and the more you can share resources. And in my research as well, larger communities tend to survive a little bit better than smaller communities from the point of view is there's, you know, more resources and more people, and you can do a lot more. And so Kyogle was chosen because it's cheaper land, you can buy large pieces of land, which means a lot of houses. And so we embarked on this journey of the Afterly Eco Village, which we're about officially 2 years into, but I've been working on for the last 5 years. And yeah, it's an interesting model to do this in the 2020s without these 70s drivers. And, you know, it's worked pretty well so far, but this affordability issue keeps coming up. And so we're trying to look at these solutions, and we're starting to come up with possibly some, which is good. They're not well developed yet, but Rob talked about the manufactured homes, and there's a real opportunity. We're looking at a rent-to-buy scheme on the community where people can, you know, they may have had enough money to buy the share, but they've got no money to build. So what do we do? How do we solve that issue? And the great thing about a manufactured home is that it's a set price. You know, you're not going to blow out the budget because it's already a set price. And we can also lend on it, if that makes sense. So we can put a manufactured home on their site, and then they pay the co-op back over a period of years as a rent-to-buy scheme for their house. So we're looking at, that's one option we're looking at for affordability. And then another option is, you know, we're talking to the RA about these houses, you know, in Lismore they are demolishing. Is there a way that we can work together? We've got the land, we've got the sites, can we bring them there? So we're talking to the RA at the moment about that as well. Trying to make it affordable for people. But yeah, it is one of the big barriers because of the lack of, that's why community title is good in that way. It allows, you know, to have financial backing. But usually community title, if you do it from the initial outset, the issue is it is expensive to do, so it's hard not to be developer driven, if that makes sense, because you need a lot of costs to start the CT rather than an MO where you need less costs. So unless it's a really well-resourced group of people, it's harder to start with a CT. So yeah, so the affordability issue is always a big issue, because generally people that are seeking this lifestyle, they're seeking this lifestyle because they don't see money as the one and only, and therefore they haven't focused on that, and so therefore they don't have a lot often, and so it's this catch-22 of you want those people, but they can't afford it, and so yeah, it's an interesting situation. And in Afterly also we've got some great. What we're also experiencing is that people that do have those resources are often the older people. And so what do we do about making sure there's a really good mix of families and young people and older people? And luckily we have some of these older people willing to sponsor some of the younger people coming in as well. So we're looking at how do we make this model affordable, in creating an MO in the 2020s. That's very different environment to back in the 1970s, especially when it's community driven. So the other aspect I noticed with a lot of these MOs was usually it was a group of people that had no knowledge of how a lot of this, now as you've been talking about, the regulations are so much more, and there's so much more things to tick off and pass through, and so it's a big task for a group of people. So with the model as well, it's like a few of us that do know some of those things have been like hired as like consultants for the first 2 years to sort of get through a lot of those things so the community doesn't fall apart trying to deal with those things. So it's kind of assisted, if that makes sense. Even though it's community-owned and driven, it's assisted by this professionality. And that's really helped as well, where I would say years ahead of if it was just community-driven without that professional help. And that doesn't include just the planning, that's like the whole, how does a community come together? How does, the governance and all those things, just getting some frameworks around those things rather than someone in the community go, oh, I know a bit about that, and then they become, there's like, okay, let's just really sit down and think about how do we do this. So yeah, it's been an interesting journey, but I am really interested in this idea of more, like what Rob talked about, sort of the peri-urban ideas and all these different ideas, but I am also passionate about it being community driven, because I've seen when things, if you do want that sense of affordability, real affordability and real sense of community, it is harder to do unless it's a really good vision and outset and design. I think you've got a good example here in Nimbin where Robin Francis, she helped develop that. It's a CT, but it's like you had a really good person helping lead that, and that's where I've seen it does work when you've got those good people leading those projects. But if they're rare, I guess, is the situation. So it's making sure how do you have the right people or make it community driven. I could go on, but I'm just actually more interested in questions.
So not including the land, how much does it actually cost to set up a community title guesstimate? Like, what are we talking?
Well, we're talking millions of dollars generally, depending on the size of the community, for the infrastructure, like roads and things like that. So, I don't know, it depends on the site, really. Some sites will be a lot cheaper, some sites will be more, but land, as you're saying, land itself these days, you'd be hard pressed to buy something under $1 million. So you're already starting from a base of that, and then you add these extra costs on top. It becomes expensive, and unfortunately, the idea of $200 shares is not. It won't happen.
They were sponsored by all the people that bought $200 shares but never lived there too.
Oh, there you go. So I mean, I just been to a communities conference and I got really fired up, and I'm in conversation with this person now of setting up a credit union that finances for MOs and things like that, because one of there used to be the Mulaney Credit Union, which was really good because it came from those roots, but unfortunately, as you know, through the regulations and whatever, has disintegrated that kind of ability to get finance. So it'd be great if the communities all got together. We all bank with someone. What if all the communities banked with the one credit union that supports communities? I'm sort of playing around with that idea with a few people at the moment. But yeah, so it's a lot of money is the answer, I guess.
And then I have one more question, sorry. How much do these model the manufactured home things? Like, what's the beginning price of one of those?
The ones we're looking at afterly are for a 2-bedroom, pretty decent size, like 75 square metres or 80 square metres or something. It's about 170,000.
Okay, that's
Yeah.
affordable compared to...
Which is, cheap if you think about that's finished, with the kitchen and everything. Yeah.
Yes. When we were doing the Bronze Eco Village, the biggest problem was the people who needed a home didn't have the money. And so I'm wondering how you got over that at Afterly, just the fact that homeless people don't necessarily have the money to be able to buy in the first instance. And just one little addition to that, the village development program that you implemented for Bruns was fabulous, and I think it would be worthwhile you talking about that a little bit before you finish your talk. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Graham. So you're a participant of the VDP, so you understand. One of the things I learned in Findhorn doing this eco-village design is at the end of this course, all of us were like, we are so equipped to now create a community together, because we've just been through this journey of learning what it takes to create a community. And through that journey, we became a community, if that makes sense. And so I went away with that thinking, this is a really great way to create a community, is to do a learning program on how to live in community and what is community. And so I have implemented that with Afterly as well, where the members went through a course, and it helped me as a planner as well, because I could get the feedback from the members, what they wanted in the community through the course to help implement in the design. So it actually is a community-driven design as well, but it's done in a fast way, because at the end of the day, I could say, no, that's not going to work, and let's move on, rather than spend a year and then realise it's not going to work from a planning sense or something like that. So, yeah, I call it a community-informed process rather than a community sort of owned, a community-informed design rather than community-driven, because it may end up years deciding on what the colour of the community house will look like or something like that. So yeah, the VDP was a result of the Bruns Eco Village project, which unfortunately didn't happen, but the success out of the Bruns Eco Village was the VDP, where a community was formed based on this learning process. So I think, yeah, coming into a community, it's really good to be informed what you're in for as well, because you might do this learning program and go, you know what, I don't think this is actually for me. And it's much better doing that right at the start than going in and going, oh, I didn't realise it was going to be like this. So yeah, that's one of the things that I'm very passionate about, is also an education process, which I'm still learning as well. It's still an education process for me, on how we all live together and in a different way. And, there's different levels of that as well. So it's also about working out as a group what level do we want to be in that as well. And that helps inform the design of what you might have the community as. So that's, I guess, a new thing that the 70s didn't have, that I'm trying to introduce with the developments as well, that there's some, at least, education process when people are joining these things, that it is, at least they might not know how to use the tool, I call it, they might not know how to use the tools of NVC and all these different methods, but at least they know there's a tool there for it, if that makes sense. So we can't, go through extensive courses on all these things, but they know there's a tool rack with those things, and, oh, I heard about that tool, let's use that, So yeah, that's something I'm very passionate about as well. And in terms of the people with no money and whatever, there is a reality check as well. We do need money to develop things, and communities, when they start now, I think they can't afford sometimes to be that complete charity. And maybe further down the track, there's more opportunities to encompass some of that. But when you're forming, you do need bricks and mortar and roads. And so, unfortunately, unless they're a homeless person that's also a road builder, it might be hard to bring that in. And that is a balance. There's some people that are passionate and really, if they have no money to their name, it's like, ooh, can you come back in 5 years' time, or something like that? Because it's like, unfortunately, there is a balance there of being real as well and not being a charity that actually may end up destroying the project altogether. So you gotta have some reality with it as well. And there is some people that do rock up and think it is a free ride and they're going to get a free house and a free thing. Is that a good attitude you want in the community as well? Like someone that thinks they can get everything for free. So, there's a balance there as well.
I just want to make a couple of comments, and Shane could throw town planning light on them. Initially in Tuntable in 1973, we just lived up goat tracks and lived in tents and made tin sheds and gradually built houses. It took years and years. It's still happening. No one trying to finish houses. No, maybe you could throw light on how that's possible or impossible under the current town planning. The second thing I want to say is that many speakers have mentioned high land price as an obstacle to formation of multiple occupancies. My master's thesis on this was on the stage, the nature of the problem and the remedy for it. Basically, I see high land prices involving human beings stealing the Creator's land, stealing First Nations land, holding future generations at bay and ripping them off, and ripping off working class people. So really, the high price of land is a form of individual theft that needs to be addressed as such quite blatantly in democratic stirring. The third thing is land tenure. Community titling involves high subdivisional costs, internal roading, sealing, and the opportunity for council to impose major conditions, especially contribution to local roads. It's far cheaper to have a company title or a cooperative title where all the controls and regulations for the community are in the one central constitution, which can be tailored to that situation. I think those are my three comments.
Thanks, David. Another elder in the space, yeah.
I was just going to mention the fact that you are saying the stumbling block to get any community title housing through is the finance. But from what I understand is that at the moment, the government wants desperately to create affordable housing, and from what I also understand, is that there is money available for that. So is there any way that you know of that you can actually dip into this money to, or bring forward a model that you might have that you can take to the government and say, this is what we can provide, can you provide us the finance for this?
Yeah, I guess I wish I could say yes, we have, we're doing that. There's a whole lot of complications with the money from government. Currently, there's a lot of money there, but you have to go through the certain right channels of a social housing provider or a community housing provider, or be an organisation that is basically funded by government. So it's harder for a bunch of people that have formed together a cooperative to come and ask for money. I'd love that we could access that money, but I don't know the avenues yet. Yeah. So we're just trying to work with what we got at the moment in terms of, I think the biggest hurdle probably for affordability in MOs is that financial institution aspect. Councils, if you do have I haven't had much problems with councils in terms of the MO concept. Generally, if you show that you're being professional and you know what you're doing and you're trying to follow the regulations, they tend to be quite open to the idea, because they, as a town planner, when I was in government, if I got something like that on a desk, deep down I'd be like, yeah, this is actually good stuff, but we have to follow the rules. So as long as you try to follow the rules, I think there's quite a lot of support in government. It's this financial institution aspect of banks not recognising shares in co-ops and things like that. So if there was a financial institution that recognised that would really change the game for MOs in the future, and the affordability aspect. So that's one of the things I think the energy should be put, rather than trying to access government funds that could be not there tomorrow, or have so many conditions and regulations attached to it that the co-op can't handle. They probably have to hire 5 staff just to manage the fund, which the fund probably spends half the money on just hiring that staff, and then it's kind of like spent the money on that rather than the housing. I guess that's my answer to that. That I'd love it if there was an easy way. I just think the ways that are available now are hard. Like you have to set up being a community housing provider or something like that, which a lot of co-ops don't have the energy or resources to do. So, I guess I think there is a talk of some co-ops. I think there's Bega down in Bega. There was a community that got funded there because they did work with government and became a community housing provider for some of their first housing. And so there is examples of communities doing that, and that requires a bit of planning in the beginnings to set that up. And that was a peri-urban one, so that's why. And that's the other issue. A lot of these MOs are in rural areas, so government's less likely to, because you're not near services and things like that. So definitely in a peri-urban community setting, it would get probably more access to funds. And just in response, I was hearing this morning a lot about the the intergenerational, and so when setting up Afterly, we also thought about that, and I think it's going to be one of the first MOs that actually has like a village area with smaller lots that are quite flat. So there is that ability for, as you age, you can sort of stay there, and less maintenance, and more accessible to the community facilities and things like that. So that was also put in the design because it seems to be something that a lot of the older communities are saying we wish we did, or something like that. So.
Shane, I'm wondering about a few nuts and bolts on the afterly. Did you start off with a group of like-minded people? How did you acquire the land? What's your ownership system? And if you've got a small group of people but a fairly large MO, how are you, if you are, how are you planning to sort of build a sense of community within those people as they come in?
It's a really good question. It did start off with an original group of people with similar mindset, but they kind of left the project early on. So there hasn't been as a unified vision, which is interesting. But as I said, through learning together, through they're still trying to work that out in the group of people there, I think, what their vision is, but there is some commonalities that they're all working on. And it was a co-op structure, so we formed a co-op, and the co-op bought the land. So it's also a low risk. I wanted to make sure it was a low risk, so when people are putting money in, you know, they're putting money into the land, not something that, you know, there's lots of examples like Nightcap Eco Village and things like that, which is these weird schemes that aren't so much community driven that can go really pear-shaped with people's money. So I wanted to ensure that there was integrity there. And so a co-op was set up and bought the land, and people formed the co-op basically. So we have a co-op, which is a brilliant model for land sharing, especially for larger communities. It might be harder for smaller communities because, you know, you have a board, for instance, in a co-op, and if there's only a community of 7, you might be all board members. So is there a need for a co-op in that situation? But definitely larger communities work well under a co-op structure, and it's working well. Yeah. It's about 20 minutes. So we also realised, you know, it's 20 minutes to town, so let's create a little village. So the plan is to have a shop there and create a sense of place there as well, so people don't have to commute every day. And the beauty of our, you know, MOs in the 2020s rather than the 70s is the working from home has become such a big factor in today's society. So these rural communities are coming back into being a lot more viable because people can work from home a lot more now. So it doesn't necessarily have to be right next to a town for people to have employment. So that's one benefit of being in the 2020s.
Just a few things I'd really like to ask you. One of them is you said you thought there was an optimal size for community that's larger rather than smaller. And I've always felt like 12 to 15 households is kind of an ideal number. And if you get bigger than that, like we've got quite a few that have got, say, 40 houses, maybe up to 100, you know, Tuntable would be the biggest, that tend to then divide into hamlets that are often geographically defined. So I'd really like to hear your thoughts on what is an optimum sort of size in terms of forming a community. Also, I think one of the things that's pushing up prices on communities here is the fact that as people age, they want housing security when they leave, and so they look to selling their house for what is going to give the optimum housing security going forward. So that is an issue, and we haven't addressed it really by not having housing for aged people. There's a really good example in Nimbin where the government put money into a youth MO that was going to be out on Stony Shoot Road. The neighbours complained. The money was pulled out and the government immediately put it into aged housing called Mulcombe House, but didn't consult with the aged community around the design of that house, and it became something that aged people couldn't live in and couldn't get on in. So I actually think, you know, it's commendable what Carol's community is doing in terms of providing housing, and presumably you're all being consulted and you know exactly what you want. But for someone like you, setting up a community and setting up a village that people can age in or whatever, how are you consulting people who are, you know, not there necessarily because they're not old enough to move into it yet? So you actually design something that elderly people can live in collectively, you know, communally. So sorry, it's a bit of a long-winded question.
Yeah, there's a
And
few
the
questions
other
in
one
there.
I was going to ask you was, how restrictive is land sizing under the state planning policy? Because it used to be like 40 hectares, which is a massive land holding for people to look after. Would there be merit in making it a lot smaller and you could still do a land sharing venture?
Well, I'll start with that question. So I think the MO policy is brilliant. I think there's not enough spoken about. You know, it was created thanks to people like Rob and others. We created this. There was this need. A planning policy was created. And if you look at the objectives of the SEP, they were achieved. And you can't say that for many planning policies, you know, like that have been created. And I think that is really sad the government hasn't praised the fact that their policy worked, which created affordable housing on marginal farmland, created community. It actually worked. I mean, look how many communities there are. And the government should really look at that and go, we've created all these other planning policies for affordability and it's just gone nowhere. But this one actually worked. So I guess the reason I said that is because about the land size, I think the MO policy works in that it is for large land holdings to not only create community but repair the land. And it's harder to do on a smaller piece of land. And so I think there maybe is a need for two kinds of MO policies. Maybe there is the large rural land sharing continues and should be expanded to every council, I think, which includes that repair. The one aspect I always got a little annoyed that wasn't in there was the agricultural food production element. I think that should have been emphasised as well, like that there is some land put aside for food production in the MO as well, rather than it just be all rainforest or all revegetation. So because then there's another thing that the MO is repairing, not only the ecology but repairing the food cycle that we have. So to answer your question, I don't think it should change in terms of having to do with land. You know, at the moment you do need large pieces of land. But maybe there's another policy created for that peri-urban MO situation that's different again. So that's my answer to that question. The optimum size, I think there is like talks of optimum size of communities, but all communities are different. As Rob said, you know, he deals with so many. Same with my experience, every community is different. So I wouldn't say there's one size fits all. In my experience, the larger communities tend to have more dynamic in terms of you can find your niche, if that makes sense. Like 150 people. And they generally are like in Muramura, when I lived there was a good example. I'd like have little hamlets, you know, and Peter Koch, who helped found that one, he explains that it's like a body, you know, and if one of the clusters is sick, you know, if you've got a broken arm, you can still operate and still function as a community with a broken arm. And so it is good to have hamlets if you become larger because of that. Because then it doesn't affect the rest of the functioning of the community if one hamlet is a bit dysfunctional. But yeah, I live on a smaller community, and what you find with a smaller community is a different dynamic where it is more interpersonal, and you have to almost deal with interpersonal more in a smaller community than a larger community because, it is more of that larger family situation where someone might be going through a lot and that affects the whole community. So I guess that's the difference between a smaller and larger community is you have to invest a bit more in that interpersonal in a smaller community than you may have to in a larger community.
And designing housing for the aged?
So as I said, we're creating a village on a flat area of the piece of land at smaller lots that, you know, if people want to stay on that community ongoing, they can move, either choose that to begin with or, you know, hopefully it comes up for availability or whatever. There's also a number of lots the co-op is retaining ownership of, so they can have options in the future of what they want to do with those lots. Yeah. Any more questions?
Just very quickly, there are communities with undeveloped sites. You say you're retaining them. I know from the community that I lived on and started, for a long time, there's real resistance to making those sites available to young people, not just available, but affordable. I mean, how much of an issue, it'd be interesting to hear from other people who live on communities, how many undeveloped sites there are that could potentially make available for people.
It would be interesting. I mean, I think it's also, there's different communities have different ideals and visions, and you can't sort of, as I said, also become a charity and let anyone in. It has to be appropriate for that community. So, yeah, with that, I think there's a clause in that in terms of it's not available for everyone. That's what I would put with that as well. But that's interesting, there's resistance. I don't know why there would be, but I haven't experienced it, so I can't answer that.
We're getting close to the end of time. If you've already asked a question, perhaps pass on to somebody who knows it.
That's what I mean.
And another 3 minutes would be great, and we can stick to time.
Oh, hello. Yeah, I've just moved. I've been in Nimbin for many years, but just moved and brought onto a community at a critical time when new undeveloped shares are being made available, or hope to be. Sorry. I forgot my question. My issue was more about the actual communication of the directors or board or shareholders, members, etc., and how you in Afterly will make your governance transparent, honest, integrity, like how do you actually enact that from the beginning? Because I think that's sometimes what's lacking. You trust it was set up in the first place with the right leaning, whether spiritual, religious, philosophical, whatever, and then how do you continue that as the generations evolve?
It's a good question. It's hard to answer. We're only 2 years in, but it's a constant thing that's been discussed about how do we communicate with members and the board and the different governance structures. Afterly's taken on a slight sociocratic trial, I would say. I don't know if it's going to continue, but we'll see. Of working groups are formed and boards. It's still a creation in process for Afterly, but definitely will need to be something focused on because of the size of it. That there is clear communication ongoing, and the board are very aware of that, and we have people in place to make sure that happens, if that makes sense. So if there is failings in that, then there's already someone there to sort of remind the board that this should be communicated, or how do we communicate this to members and things like that. But of course, it's a two-edged sword, because the beauty of a board is they can make the day-to-day decisions, so things can happen a lot faster. But then, of course, the members feel left out of what's actually happening. But then if you get all the members involved, then nothing really happens. So it's a two-edged sword.
Have you worked out anything about percentage-wise votes and things like that, which is something that often communities stumble over? If you've got a proposal, and then is it going to be 51% versus 49%, or is it 70% agreement or whatever? Or if you have consensus, how do you actually make that workable?
Well, the co-op rules already have things around that, so it's already in place with the co-op. But I can speak from my own community, my smaller community that I live on. We had a double consensus process because someone really believed in consensus. And I used to be a big believer in consensus. But I actually tried to remove that, and I don't know the answer, I guess. In an ideal world, consensus, yes, but from my experience, I think what I've experienced is that what you want to do is reduce the amount of time between, for that politicking. So if a decision has to be made and you don't come to consensus, leave only a very small amount of time when you come to before that decision and the next decision, because if you stretch it out, that's a lot of time to politic.
Thank you so much to Shane. One more clap. Thank you. Fantastic.